Well, good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us on the Supply Chain Talent Study. My name is Jeff. I'll be your host for today's event, which means I'll be in the background answering any general or technical questions from any of you that do need assistance. During today's call, if you have any questions at all, please type them in the chat area and please make sure to send them to all panelists. This event is being recorded, and without further ado, it's my extreme privilege to turn the call over to Mr. Robert Bauman. Robert, the call is yours.
Thanks, Jeff, and hello, everyone, and welcome to the Supply Chain Insights webinar series. I am Bob Bowman. I'm Managing Editor of Supply Chain Brain, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. Now, today we are presenting Supply Chain Talent, the Missing Link. This webinar is based on a recent Supply Chain Insights research report with the same title that can be found on the Supply Chain Brain website, that's supplychainbrain.com. Now, our speakers today will be Lora Cecere. She is founder and CEO of Supply Chain Insights. She'll be joined by panelist Jake Barr. Jake is Global Director of Supply Network Operations at Procter & Gamble. Joe Krkoska, Supply Chain Director and Business Manufacturing Leader for External Manufacturing with Dow AgroSciences. And Marcia Conner, who is Principal at Sensify. Now, as Jeff said, we're going to save your questions for the end, but we will compile them as we go. So if you have a question, go ahead and message it in the chat window to our panelists. Now, the Twitter hashtag for our event today is hashtag SCIWebinar. We'll be continuing the conversation on Twitter from 1 to 1:30 Eastern. So please feel free to tweet out to your network some fun facts and nuggets of information you may find interesting, so we can continue in that way. At this point, I am pleased to turn it over to Lora Cecere. Lora?
Thank you so much, and I am so pleased to be joined by three of my very favorite people on this topic. Marcia is a learning expert, and I have learned so much from Marcia and her books about adult learning. And Joe is a wonderful leader at Dow, as Jake is a wonderful leader at Procter & Gamble. And Joe and Jake have been talking to me for many years about the evolution of talent. And today we want to really showcase some research we were able to do with Supply Chain Brain around supply chain talent, which I believe is the missing link as we look at Supply Chain 2020. We're going to divide this up into sections. We will talk about current state and where we are today. We'll then have the panelists really talk about their situation, what they're doing, their perspective, to validate it, bring on the questions as we go along. And then we're going to talk about where we see this going in the next 5 years, because what we're going to see is a real tightening of talent in the next 5 years due to global expansion, supply chain leaders getting new opportunity, and the retirement of baby boomers. And so we're going to talk about what do we do about that and possible solutions. So with that, let me set the stage with the research. We conducted the research in the October period, this is very recent research, and we started out asking individuals what was their highest level of business pain. These are supply chain leaders. Most of them are manufacturers, but there are a few retailers in the demographics. And you can see that talent is at the middle in terms of how the perceived pain is seen. The ability to get to data in an organization is the top level of business pain, and the ability for actionable analytics. So while many people are sitting at their desks today really struggling with getting data, underneath the supply chain, we believe there's a big issue percolating around talent. And it isn't just any talent. As we look at the ability to manage talent, the consultants feel that they do a much better job of managing talent than the manufacturer and supply chain leaders. And in my research career, I've done a couple of surveys on talent, and what I see is the manufacturing leaders feel that they are doing a little bit worse on talent development than they have done in prior years. And the reason is that if we look at number of unfilled positions, that we currently are reaching a place where more and more supply chain leaders that I talk to will talk to me about the number of unfilled positions. So as we look at this chart, the purple would be supply chain leaders, which would be for manufacturers, retailers, and distributors, and the green looks at the number of consultants. So you can see that in the study that 24% had 1 to 10% of jobs open, 14% of manufacturers had 11 to 20%, and 22% of the manufacturers had over 20%, and 16% didn't know. So the number of jobs that are open is higher than I've seen it, and the length of times that a job is open is also higher. We did a similar study on talent 3 months ago where we found out that the average time that a supply chain planner is open is 5 months. And that's very different than what we saw 2 or 3 years ago. Now, a lot of people talk about talent, and I've been to a lot of university sessions where the prominent university is talking about really bringing talent to market. So one of my key learnings from this study is that the biggest talent shortage is mid-management, and it's driven by those 3 factors that I started out with. The good news is supply chain leaders have more opportunities. They're seen as business leaders that are high potential, and they're getting more opportunities. The second issue is that as we grow through global expansion, we aren't seeing the development of talent to the degree that we have demand in emerging economies like Brazil and China and India. And then the third is the pending baby boomer retirements. We're starting to see a wave in retirements that is really at a level I haven't seen before in my career. And so those 3 factors together are coming together really for this mid-management talent issue that's really putting a lot of pressure on the supply chain. Now, traditionally, when we've had openings, we would just go to the outside job market and we would recruit. And what we found is when we looked at how companies typically fill these mid-management positions, and we looked at whether we do it from within or from outside, we see that the supply chain leaders and manufacturers, 42% are looking to fill them within, but they're finding shortages, and 20% are looking to fill them outside. But again, we are not able to get the level of people, particularly in the planning ranks, that we need. And as we look at what's easy and what's tough, you can see that the green represents easy and the red represents the degree of difficulty. The easiest positions are in customer service, transportation management, and supply planner, manufacturing planner, more of those plant type of positions. Where we typically have more difficulty is where planning meets strategy in terms of Vice President of Procurement, Director of Supply Chain Planning, Vice President of Supply Chain, and Manager of Key Projects. And those are the hardest positions that people are seeing to fill, along with, we're seeing some issues around demand planning and some of the issues around S&OP. So it's the combination of supply chain strategy, supply chain leadership, and specialized skills in the supply chain. So as we look at entry-level positions, the universities are doing a pretty good job in the basic supply chain stuff. But the real key issues that we're seeing there is really more around the prep around communication, oral communication, written communication, and the higher performance and higher importance positions around teamwork and analytic skills. And so while most of the universities are doing the basic block and tackling around what is supply and what are, things like MRP or DRP, the basics, it's really more of these soft skills and the ability for team communication and teamwork that we're seeing more of the gap. So with that, Bob, I'll turn it back to you, and maybe we can get some interaction from the panelists.
Yeah, we do actually, Laura, have a few questions here just to kind of address what you've brought up in that first section. This question for Jake. Jake, are you surprised by these findings? And if so, what is P&G doing about it?
Well, Laura, actually, I would hate to be first in the segment that answered they don't know how big their gap was.
Okay, no, Jake has always known how big, yeah.
I'm just absolutely amazed by that. You know, honestly, I'm actually creating one of those gaps, and I think I'm a good test case because I'm actually retiring myself at the end of this year. But on a serious note, what you're seeing here, it actually reflects exactly what we're seeing. It confirms it. You know, both in the numbers and an absolute context, the segment, the type of skills that are missing, and importantly, the type of gap. So what do they need to show up with, and are they prepared to lead? I believe, honestly, it's reflecting a collision of what I call two worlds. It's first the pre-supply chain thinking and post. You know, the game's changed on both the skill requirements of what we expect each individual supply chain leader to be able to do and how you must be able to analyze and attack problems. It also represents a gap in the middle of the organization on how to bridge that generational divide. You know, as we went through this transition and most companies began accelerating their business models or entering white space, et cetera, you know, traditional managers, I'm going to term it that, stayed in their comfort zone. In many cases, those were functional silos. And because of that, it left a void of the talent that needed to step up and be holistic supply chain leaders that could command and manage those leadership and commercial interactions. So, you know, I honestly believe the issue is most firms are significantly behind on preparing both the size of the gap today and over the next 5 years, and have no way of honestly stepping into the void and saying, okay, now we know there's a gap, and preparing the skills. We've addressed both.
Okay, thanks, Jake. Now, Marcia, you're in a pretty good position to answer this next question because I believe you're the author of your latest book is called The New Social Learning, if I'm not mistaken. Do you have any insight on constructing programs for reskilling mid-management?
Yes, thank you. In my research and the time I've spent with large organizations focused specifically on how to create the right workforce to do extraordinary work, we find very consistently that the training organizations, those focused specifically on education, have failed organizations. It's not that they can't do some things very well, but it's not just a supply chain where there are older models being used that aren't keeping up with the technologies and the needs of today's business leaders, mid-managers, frontline, as well as executive leadership. And what I encourage people to do who are facing the dilemma of not knowing where to find the right people or being able to retrain middle managers from other parts of the organization for these roles is to ask the question, is to ask really three questions. Is your training organization just stuck in old mindsets and limited views of how people learn, believing that perhaps just classroom training or the topics they've taught over the years are the only solution? Or is it that they actually are very progressive in their approaches, but they have a limited knowledge set of planning and the needs you have for the leaders that you're working with? And then in some cases, is it that you have both dilemmas, that they're both stuck in old mindsets, a very schoolhouse approach to education, and that they have a lack of knowledge? Based on where they are really helps you understand how you reskill the educators in your organization. Because as Laura's research showed and we see in the marketplace, people are having to find ways of approaching these without using those education departments that are already there. And then based on which dilemma you're in, you can look at if you can reskill those departments or if you can find somebody who really knows both the topics that need to be addressed in your particular organization, because there's often so much nuance that needs to be addressed in each group, or if you can identify the right people and then really lend them to the education organization for a while to train other people to be able to teach, or if you can identify somebody from the outside, or if you really need people truly who have a different view of education and you need to intermediate there. So there are apprentice programs, there are job swaps, there are ways that we can take people who know the topics and move them into organizations that understand learning and marry those two together to be able to provide good solutions. But until you can figure out which of those problems you are facing, it's very, very hard to identify what you're going to do to be able to create a solution that's unique and wonderful for your organization.
Thanks, Marcia. And for those who are just joining us, that was Marcia Conner at Sensify. Our panel also consists today of Jake Barr of Procter & Gamble and Joe Krkoska at Dow AgroSciences. And Joe, I'm going to direct this question to you. As you look at this data, what are you seeing in your organization? What do you think it means for the development of your supply chain strategy for 2013?
Well, I think the crux of the issue to me is this idea that knowledge is cumulative. So we've done a great thing, I think, in terms of productivity across multiple industries by breaking things into buckets and then allowing people to become expert in their bucket. And now it's time to start connecting all the buckets, and that takes pretty complicated systems. It takes more sophisticated thinking. And with each generation, if I can call it that, although these generations are getting shorter and shorter, people learn more, we build more into our processes, our procedures, our ways of doing business, and then when we lose that talent, because knowledge is cumulative, it becomes more and more difficult to backfill those people. So for the first time in our organization, we're actually hiring people into newly created roles specifically for the purpose of trying to share and leverage best practice, and I'll use that term loosely, but imagine taking your best planner globally and now saying your job is now full-time, assuring that the new people coming into this particular role are using the best tools, the best systems, and they understand the business model, they know how to think end-to-end, and these are people who have been with the business long enough that they actually understand the business model. So yes, we're seeing these challenges, and yes, we're responding in ways that we have not done before.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Jake, one more question for you at this point, and maybe you can elaborate on what you just said earlier, but I'm wondering if you have more to say about the lessons that were learned with mid-management training reskilling at P&G.
Yeah, I do, Bob. Thank you. I want to first build on Marcia's point and echo what she was referring to around the need to identify people in the organization. And I would tell you that it's twofold. It's both those with the requisite skills and a key that we found towards sustaining on a long term. So we have both the approach that you heard just a second ago. We have global process leaders for every process, every piece of expertise that we have on the planet. And there's a single point accountable individuals that's supported by a team that actually are double-headed, and they own that work on a day-in, day-out basis. But we give them accountability for developing the toolkits and the process and the training and the development of their peer group, no matter which operating division they may work in. The second piece that we've done on this mid-management level, folks, is we've made leaders accountable. So as Laura has seen a bit from us, all of our senior level leaders, including myself, are accountable for leading and conducting part of the training and development of our mid-level managers. So every single person, from our chief supply chain officer through all the way through the organization, each of our directors own a specific segment of our leadership and development training of these mid-level managers on each of these focus areas.
Okay, Jake, thanks very much. At this point, let's move on to the next segment of our agenda, and I'm going to turn it back over to Lora Cecere of Supply Chain Insights. Laura?
Well, thank you so much. So we have talked about the gap, and we've talked about where the gap is the most critical. And I think the discussion around it isn't just old-fashioned classroom training, that it really requires rethinking about mentoring, apprenticeship, and looking at how do we do experiential training. Let's look at where we're headed in the next 5 years. So if we take a look at this slide, which is one I really like from the research, you know, what we were doing was we were saying today what are your top 3 problems? And then when you look at the next 5 years, what do you think your top problems will be? Today, what people talk about is, you know, my employees are reluctant to adopt the new ways of thinking. But that's not going to be the highest issue in the next 5 years. Instead, what people are really looking for, because supply chain's changing, it has many flavors of supply chain in the organization now. It isn't just in a function. Supply chain, as Joe was saying, is connecting the buckets. And we've got supply chain and customer service teams, and we've got supply chain and supplier development, and supply chains and social corporate responsibility. So people are looking at clear job progression. What's my job going to look like? And what kind of opportunities are there going to be for me? And we also see that people want to be sure that there's enough people to do the work, that they're being adequately taken care of. And there's an increased need for more of what I'm going to call supply chain HR, the ability to have planning, to look at training differently, and to really embrace this missing link in the supply chain. The biggest impact is going to be the retirement of these key supply chain employees. And, you know, I think it's important to step back and think that supply chain as we know it has evolved underneath our feet for the last 30 years. I remember fighting to have a supply chain organization. I remember the first wave of supply chain leaders. And we've got a lot of tribal knowledge that we've gained over those 30 years. And as Jake had talked about, we've got a lot of people that have very deep expertise. And this retirement and the loss of the tribal knowledge and how do we make this more systematic and spread it and also grow globally is our challenge. So we're facing how do we put the processes in place to embrace the human resource potential of the supply chain. And so if we look at the top 3 issues that people felt in the next 5 years, it's really what will that job progression look like? What will it look like when we connect the buckets? What will it look like in terms of my ability to grow and be a contributor in global projects or new economies? And will you take care of me? Will you be sure that there's enough people on my team, you know, enough people to get the job done? Because often I hear supply chain leaders talk about that they may reward the urgent over the important. And so the time to use these new tools, to work as teams and coordinate work. And then this whole issue around changing skill level, right? The ability to embrace the new level of mathematical analytical skill, or the ability for people that don't manufacture anymore to teach people about manufacturing. We have new kinds of skill tensions that are coming into the organization because we grew the supply chain on the backs of in-source manufacturing. As we outsource manufacturing, we're really challenged. How do we teach supply chain leaders around manufacturing and procurement processes that they may not actually ever really get to experience? And then this level around executive understanding of supply chain talent, really helping people to see this not as just something that's going to be quickly fixed, but something that requires a rethinking of HR systems. So that's some of the issues that we're seeing in the next 5 years, Bob.
Thanks, Laura. So I have a few more questions for the panel based on what you just said. Jake Barr, Procter & Gamble, can you pinpoint what the changing skill level requirements are?
Bob, yes, I believe you can. In our case, because the industry pace, as Laura has described it, is picking up and becoming more volatile, you know, we've placed a premium on ensuring that we deliver, I'll call it trained business managers or business consultants for our operational leaders. So supply chain leaders that can adapt in an agile way to allow us to compete. Now, some of the skills that we ensure we're looking for with hard physical evidence we've insisted that all of our younger folks that are coming into the organization have demonstrated that they are change agents. So this can easily be deduced by, going through a series of questions on kind of life experiences, let alone jobs experiences, because that helps us to adapt and adjust ahead of competition. They've got to obviously be technically sound. That's like the price of entry. But we also look for more well-rounded folks to work in the supply chain than we've done ever in the past. So business savvy, leadership skills, financially astute, so they have financial acumen even before they show up. Obviously, they have to be skilled at problem solving. So we do that because you're operating in a dynamic environment, and our business is all about solving problems day to day. I don't think you can work in the supply chain arena without that. And then finally, and it's perhaps obvious again, but they have to be able to dynamically organize, energize, and enable people to deliver or demonstrate a breakthrough that might not have been accomplished before. It's really critical in our operation. Now, two other seed actions that we've taken, to Laura's point on the organizational component, is we've understood you just can't deliver a transformation on all those elements completely overnight. So we try and help to seed the organization we've doubled down, as an example, on the number of interns and co-ops that we bring out of these programs. But in doing so, let me describe that. We ensure that any individual has had a minimum of 2 intern or co-op experiences with us before we even offer a full-time role, up to 4 experiences. So you need to think about that. To Laura's point, they're almost in a middle management kind of mode because of the experiences you've given them before they even start earning their first full-time paycheck. We've modified our rotation process to the point, Laura is talking about, the diminishing law. So Laura, we have nearly 20% of our folks who are at or beyond retirement age eligibility in that middle segment. And so what we've done is we've also doubled down on how we've been moving our key young leaders across through not only a manufacturing operations assignment, an engineering program leadership role, a purchasing leadership role, an operations role, managing the customer component or a material supply component, all of those ahead of schedule that we might have done in the past.
Thank you, Jake. Marcia Conner of Sensify, in terms of job progress and career path, do you have any insight as to how companies can do it better?
Yes. We can all do it better. We can all be learning more how we are naturally equipped to learn. If we just step back from the confines often that we face in the business world, we discover that human beings have lasted this long in civilization because we are learning machines. We are naturally equipped to take in information, to take in the world around us, and to be able to make sense of that. But so often, how people are doing that around us is very limited. We're not able to see what people are doing around us. And so in addition to the wonderful sorts of cross-training programs that we're hearing about from P&G, where all the leaders are accountable for educating others about what they are doing and how they are doing that, that's an incredible approach. We often need to simply ask the question, what are the obstacles keeping people who we're bringing into the organization, or even cross-training, as we'll probably talk about a little bit later, what are we doing to be able to give people a sense as to what the role encompasses? What are those subtleties? What are those new breakthroughs? And how can we remove the obstacles keeping people from being able to do what they're naturally capable of doing? Frankly, I suspect some of you are thinking that's just too simple. It's not as though people can just pick up this sort of expert knowledge. But what we find, especially when we interview people who are soon to be retiring, and we ask them, what can we do for your organization? What can we do for you to be able to help the next round of workers in our organization succeed? They say, please don't confine people as much as you have in the past to only be doing a certain set of tasks. or give us more opportunity to be learning from one another. Things like social networks, for the first time in the work world, are allowing people to see and get a sense of what people are doing throughout the course of the day, when that is appropriate or available for their jobs. But it's also getting a sense as to what the people, that are in the senior leaders of the organization, as well as the front line, are doing on a day in and day out basis. So you can prevent problems up ahead by just having a better sense of what's going on day in and day out. So removing obstacles, and as well as giving people a chance to learn from one another in the moment as work comes up and as it will address their needs in the future. What I can do right now from what's going on around me to make decisions as to how to make changes. And it's not crazy. In this case, it's not even that difficult. It's just so very, very different than how we have thought about learning and process and education in the past.
Brave new world. Thanks, Marcia. Jake, one more question on this score. It appears to be that there's just not enough people to do the work. How do you feel about outsourcing, and how do we get this work done?
Bob, the answer is you can absolutely do that. I personally don't believe that that's the answer. I believe if you actually build a continuous improvement organization, you take some of the steps that we're describing where you put in place cross-functional centers of excellence that aren't just set-aside training people, but are actually part of the base day operation, that own accountability and are rewarded for driving that kind of performance, that you'll get a better result. Now, I don't want to discredit at all anyone who's potentially using an outsourced strategy, but I do believe it raises a very ugly question around accountability for the outcome. So I think if you choose to do it, it's a huge undertaking, and it's not something that you can just say, okay, there they have it, it's theirs, and boy, aren't I glad they're going to handle all that now. Because I honestly believe your level of expertise needs to go up when you make an outsource decision, not down.
Great. Okay.
Because they're not going to do process re-engineering for you. You'll still have to do that.
Yeah. Let's move on to the section entitled Possible Solutions. Once again, I turn it back to Lora Cecere.
Thank you so much. 4 years ago, I thought the possible solution was a supply chain center of excellence, that we could have a supply chain center of excellence and that we could build kind of what we think are the processes that drive differentiation, and we could drive training programs, and we could drive innovation from those. In my experience over the last 5 years, I've become, I've been watching certain supply chain centers of excellence that have done very well and certain ones that have become very academic. So I don't just think the answer is in supply chain centers of excellence. I think that supply chain centers of excellence are part of the solution, but they can also be part of the problem if we let them become too academic. And so what I'd like to do is talk now about the research and what people saw as the potential solutions, because they really come down to more of a holistic HR strategy. So when we look at cross-training, as fundamental as cross-training is, right? I am shocked in the research to see how little cross-training we have. So let's look at where people see that they need cross-training and where people offer cross-training. So in the area first of manufacturing, which I don't know, I'm kind of old school. I don't believe that any of the functions other than maybe distribution or 3PLs that we can really say we're supply chain leaders unless we have an appreciation of manufacturing. We see that 62% say that it's needed. I would actually say it's probably more than that, and only 24% offer it. Likewise in distribution, and in my career, I was shocked to find out how different it is to run a warehouse than a manufacturing plant. We can see that 60% believe it's needed and 26% offer it. procurement. You know, how often, you know, we talk about the supply chain being from the customer's customer to supplier's supplier, but very few companies, in fact, only 20% of companies offer cross-training into procurement. But when we get into the areas around strategy and finance and marketing, the gap is even greater. And so, you know, the cross-functional nature of supply chain and the ability to look at cross-training in these areas, and even IT, one of my observations is that when IT and line of business have cross-training opportunities across the walls of traditional roles, they do so much better, and also into sales. So the first thing that I learned from this study is we started out in functions, we're still in functions, and that one of our opportunities is cross-training. And the cross-training can look very different for different organizations. It can be internships, it can be cross-functional programs, it can be special assignments, but this whole gap in cross-training is something I think we should think about and put in a piece of our holistic HR strategy around breaking down the functions and doing more cross-training. Now, when we look at potential solutions and we ask supply chain leaders to tell us what was the performance and what was the most important, what you're going to see on the right-hand side is what people thought was the most important piece to actually drive this change. And so promoting from within and existing employee training. I'm not talking about the old-fashioned training. You know, Marcia was pretty good, I think, to put a box around. That's not what we're talking about. But really to be able to look at HR systems around, you know, how are we promoting from within? What is the whole skill attainment to be able to run the gauntlet through the career and to be able to look at what that career progression looks like? Now, one of the things that I was a little disappointed in view of this skill gap and what I consider, you know, the missing link in the supply chain is training budgets. That only 16% of manufacturers have higher training budgets, 16% of consultants. The majority of people have the same training budget, and if you look at manufacturers, because much of the training has been done on projects, on the back of IT projects, we actually see that manufacturers are decreasing their budgets. You can see that 20% have lower and 22% don't know, which I think is even more problematic that they don't know. So, you know, just to wrap up, you know, possible solutions, I think that clear career progression, holistic HR thinking, and thinking about new techniques for training. And I think cross-training across the functions is just really key. Back to you, Bob.
Thanks, Laura. Let me pick up on that subject of cross-training with a question for Jake. Could we cross-train people in other roles, Jake, and what roles are potentially the most viable? In other words, what makes for effective cross-training?
Well, Bob, as Laura knows, we've been at this a bit, so we've had a head start here. Our supply chain organization actually went first into place in 1986. So we've had a head start in trying to do some of the early experimentation. But I can tell you that what we've learned, tried and true, is that if you're going to be a supply chain leader, you've got at least 4 fundamental blocks of experience. First, you have an operational block, is what we call it. Now, that for anyone, that can be very different depending on their business model, but it's grounding them in the products, the processes, and the technologies that you are going to either offer for sale or that you make and make available. Second, the individuals have to be trained in how to plan. You know, if you're in the supply chain world, you must understand how to plan. Plan executional at an executional level, plan and strategize what a supply chain and a business model needs to look like. It goes on and on. The third piece is obviously they need to be exceptional program leaders. You know, I say that because in jest, there is no static supply chain because there is no static business model. So a supply chain leader is in a constant state of change, some might call it chaos, but always managing a program, an improvement project, a new implementation, a new initiative, whatever. And then fourth, they actually must be prepared to lead on the business front. And this is where the being able to deal with commercial leadership, both external to the company that you might be employed by, for your partners, whether that's material supply or distribution networks, or importantly, the retail channels that you might sell through, let alone your own top leadership. So those are things that we've noticed, that as we move people across our disciplines, whether it's in manufacturing or engineering or purchasing or quality assurance, we concentrate on those 4 blocks and ensure that they all get those components as they move across. I want to add one bullet, though, Bob, that goes beyond your question, and it just speaks to the comment Laura made around training budgets. So, Laura, I think, honestly, you shouldn't be too surprised by some of the results, because I think the content of how people are training has vastly changed. So years ago, our training budgets would be exceptionally huge, and it'd be because we had to bring everyone together, put them in what I'd call a classroom environment, and speak at them. Today, we put them through dynamic modeling or simulation exercises that model the work that they're going to do, and they're able to do that on the web. So the cost to be able to deliver that has shrunk dramatically. So we use the term that we train over 50% more people than we did before at half the price and half the amount of time.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks, Jake. Marcia, have you seen other areas with similar issues? What can we learn from other organizations?
Well, wonderful point made that it's not surprising that the training budgets are going down, but I want to be real clear that they're not just going down in this area. They're going down across the board for the very reasons just stated, because we have moved away in many cases, though not all, from classroom models to more dynamic models. But there's still a lack of attention being focused in all types of organizations on truly understanding what it is that our workforce knows now, and then be able to remediate that gap. So, I work with a number of organizations that have taken on a very specific approach as to how to tackle this talent challenge, and those include, bridging the needs between manufacturing and retail environments, pharmaceutical companies, and a wide variety of them. It's not that you need to be looking outside the organization all the time, as has been stated before, but it's a truly understanding where the people in your organization, even if they're not in these roles today, where their aptitudes are. So the 3-pronged approach we take consistently is to do some of that testing for aptitude, something that has been historically unheard of in organizations in the hiring process. But that is not in any scary way, if we look at privacy concerns or things like that, to simply let the workforce, the across the board workforce, know that there are these open positions and that we are willing to help train and be able to fill some of those gaps with skills and be able to help them do that. So to test for aptitude, find out where people are, and then to be able to really assess for attitude. Some of the 3 keys that Jake was just talking about are not ones that are necessarily skills that you deliver to people or have them work in those dynamic environments, but they have to be the attitudes that people have about approaching almost chaotic situations, of constantly rapidly changing environments, of where there needs to be an understanding of both the small details as well as the big bricks, as Laura would say. And then to be able to create training, cross-training, say dynamic, static, customized, traditional and untraditional, I'll just say that, to be able to train for that altitude, where people are able to step and be high enough in the organization in their own skins, in their own comfort, to be able to look and say, I can tackle this, and I'm willing, and I'm able, and I want to do this. And that allows people to stay in those roles for a long time. So we have to look at the aptitude, attitude, and that altitude to be able to really diagnose where we are, what the gaps are, and how we're going to fill them. And then who we need to access to be able to help create programs to be able to really meet those skill needs.
Thanks, Marcia. Joe Krkoska, what have we learned about the management of high potentials and the staffing of global positions as well?
Well, I think as it relates to high potentials, those are the folks that I think, first of all, every organization needs to be able to point to a process that is run routinely and rigorously to identify that kind of talent. And then these things that Marcia and Jake have been talking about, these critical success factors, you want to try and apply those to every person in the organization, but it becomes especially critical when managing top talent. I think one of the things that differentiates top talent is they often have all of the basic blocking and tackling that a number of strong candidates do, but they also have something special as it relates to vision and change leadership, and I'll call it the hunger factor. People that have this thirst for change and improvement, I think those are things that are part of the list that differentiates the top performers. One of the critical success factors that has been alluded to in terms of cross-functional experience, I don't know that anyone hit cross-geographic experience, and this is an area where with high potentials we pay particular attention, especially if you're running a global business. Then clearly your top potential people need to have global experience. And so getting them assignments in Europe or Latin America or wherever your critical regions are, I think is critical to their development. And back to your question on what about filling global roles, yes, high potential talent is part of that equation. But back to this idea that you have a lot of people in the organization who are going to need that kind of knowledge. One of the attributes of top talent is they tend to move quickly from assignment to assignment because you need them to have enough runway left. By the time they hit their mid-40s, they need to be in these top leadership positions. So how do you accomplish that? Well, we talked a little about that, but you also have to pay attention to the foundation of your organization. And those people need to get global, cross-geography, cross-business experience so they can continue to hold and be the keeper of the keys of these critical business processes that we keep referring to.
Thanks, Joe. Well, at this point, why don't we move to some questions from our audience? And what I'm going to do is I'll throw these out to the panel and to Lora as well, and whoever wants to tackle them is free to do so. This question comes from the audience. It is, why do you believe the lack of clear job progression is so abundant? Many large corporations have talent advancement and management programs, yet they don't reflect much positive impact. Even in 5 years, it's still the biggest issue. Anyone?
Well, we may have a tussle for that one. Jake or Joe, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll take a run at it. This is Joe. I think it will become even more problematic. That's not a great start to an answer, is it? Because I think as you look back, there was perhaps this illusion of stability. Things maybe did not change as quickly across the value chain as they do today. And so there was a time, I think, and a lot of large multinational companies invested effort into defining career paths and showing them to, engineers who start in a manufacturing facility. Here's what your first job will be, and here are the likely paths, and here's how you get to point X. But I think, as Jake pointed out a little earlier, these things are always changing, and I think they're changing faster now than they have before, and that will make obvious career paths and recipes less likely than they were before. But I do think we still try and show our new hires, our young folks, especially in the organization, what their possibilities are. And I think we're more deliberately talking to them. I know in our company, on an annual basis, we have a formal checkpoint on a person's development plan. And 3 questions that always come up are, what are your aspirations in terms of job level? What kind of function do you see yourself working in the long term? And do you have any mobility or geographic restrictions or preferences? And with those 3 questions, annually, we refresh their views on those things so that we can try and design things that are specifically going to, scratch their itch in terms of career satisfaction. And we do that with all of our professional employees.
Yeah, Joe, I couldn't agree more. In fact, yeah, can you hear me, Bob?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so Joe, I couldn't agree more. In fact, we find that today we have virtually the opposite of what we had several years ago, where we have individuals that hire in and do not want a specific tailored recipe cooked career path, but want a set of experiences with the freedom to experiment in the early stage of their career while still delivering results and building leadership skills. But we literally provide them an opportunity to order from what we call a restaurant menu during the first few years to allow them to broaden out their end-to-end understanding. And then as they progress, we do, as Joe was describing, we have not only an annual checkpoint with them, but we also allow them to determine what are their principal passion areas. So what is it that they really have a calling to as they get through the experimentation. That allows us to also segment those into the top, call it 10%, that are going to be our vice presidents for the future that we can index forward on, as well as the 10 or 15% of the folks that want to and have a wonderful desire to be deep technical masters in a specific area. I actually want to give credit to several companies that are out in the industry. We learned an awful lot from some of IBM's early approaches and several other companies who have understood the need for a sustaining component of their workforce that have a deep technical mastery and don't choose or desire to be an organizational leader that's going to need to lead 3,000 or 4,000 people at some point in the future. So we've got both, but you're right, it's not a cookie cutter where they want to come in and do the same job for the next 20 to 30 years.
Okay, thanks. Another question from the audience, is there a defined strategy to help identify the mix between hiring undergraduates, graduates, and mid-career individuals for filling the supply chain gap?
I believe there is, and I think it all starts with your, I'll call it your bell-shaped curve on your distribution of talent in the existing organization. We overlay with that not only the experience levels, but what our needs are going to be projected out over the next 3 to 5 years. And that helps us determine the mix of those that we may want advanced degrees and or advanced experience base as we bring, and I have to remind people we're a promote from within organization. So by default, that allows us to identify people from the very beginning that we're going to fast track into an experience level that may be faster than the norm.
And the only thing I would add to that is just this idea that not only do you have the dimensions that you mentioned, undergraduate, graduates, mid-career, but there's the internal and external dimension. There's also obviously the skill sets necessary, but I also think there's a space in here that deserves some thought depending on your business, and that is what type of discipline mix do you want to have in your supply chain organization? And so in my particular company, I find myself thinking about engineers, for example, versus supply chain professionals versus business majors versus agronomists. I think there's some space in your strategy that needs to be dedicated to that subject as well, because I think the best supply chain organization or team has that right balance based on the needs of a certain time period.
Amen, Joe. We use a mix of that. Yep.
Okay, great. Another question, do you believe these talent issues affect a certain industry more so than another?
All you have to do is take a look at not only Lora's research, but the most recent annually updated and annual periodical from the Gartner group to prove that not only is this an ongoing issue, it's getting bigger. And it's not germane just to a specific industry, it stretches across all of them. That's the horrific nature of this thing.
Right. And we didn't see a difference by industry in that gap that we showed where we needed people that had deep planning expertise along with business understanding. And the difficult thing is you just can't take somebody from one organization and plug them into another. It really requires onboarding. So I think it's across all industries.
One of the challenges that organizations are facing is that when we actually look at the training and learning requirements, we almost immediately all go towards formal education, some movement from the college years into the workforce. But deep and wide research shows that greater than 80% of all learning that happens within an organization is informal, not designed or specified by one department or even by a program, greater than 80%. Yet we spend the vast majority of our time working towards that, less than 20% that is affected in that area. So I ask organizations of all types, in all industries, to ask the simple question, for people to ask themselves the question, which is, how did you get to where you are? How did you learn these things? What are the types of things that were informal, between people, in the moment, at an event, in the experiences that you picked up along the road? And how can you reflect those sorts of experiences and provide more of those for the people in your organization so that they have a far wider breadth of knowledge and are able to, frankly, see wider and farther than they ever could by simply focusing on those more formal processes. That's where you really can get cross-cultural, cross-country, cross-geography, where you can pick up what is learned, that people can apply what they've learned from the last job into what they know. It's not going to relate one-to-one, but there are probably some pieces that can apply. And then to actually do the interviewing of your highest performers, to be able to spend some time with them and ask them in your organization, what have you done? What are those experiences you've had? Who are those mentors you have met with? What are those times when that light bulb went off and you said, this made a big difference? What are those pivotal points? And then start worrying and thinking about how you can make that available to more people in a scalable way. And when that can happen, you really have an opportunity for there to be far quicker growth, for there to be quicker onboarding and bringing people into these roles that are so needed today.
Thanks, Marcia. I think we have time for maybe one more quick question, so let me throw this out real quickly. Do companies actually spend the money that is allocated for training? Anyone?
I'll give a quick answer because I don't know how to answer that question anymore. If you look at the R&D that says that 70% of adult learning happens in the role, I don't know how to separate out training anymore in any practical way. So yes, we still have the attending workshops and conferences and things of that nature, but to me, the real training, the value-added meat of the thing is happening in the jobs, that 70-20-10 research. So that's my answer.
Bob, the research... Go on, please.
Bob, I'll add to that and just simply say I echo Joe's comment. We spend every dollar that's available to us to deliver the new techniques. We're always thinking ahead. But as Joe described, we've built so much of the practice into the way we do the daily work that it's almost inseparable at this point.
Okay. Marcia, it sounded like you had a final word.
Yes, so the research shows that organizations, the money dedicated for formal education is spent very consistently and usually spent earlier in the year. Then so there's not really monies available by the end of the year. So it's done. But to address the larger point is that learning, unlearning, and relearning happen in far larger spaces than the education department. And the question becomes is, are there dollars available in other parts of the organization that could be used to not provide those formal pieces, but those informal opportunities to be able to mentor or cross-train and get people up to speed, and that we really don't have any way of measuring. But there are surely some very systematic ways we can target and find those monies to be able to apply when we know the sorts of delivery mechanisms that will do the best job.
Okay, thank you so much, Marcia, and thank you to all of our panelists. I just want to very quickly mention that Supply Chain Brain hosts a powerful job finder platform that helps companies find qualified candidates to fill supply chain management positions by screening, grading, and ranking all resumes to provide the best match. You can check it out at www.supplychainbrain.com under Ultimate Job Finder. Also, the Supply Chain Insights Talent Research Report is available on the Supply Chain Insights channel, again on supplychainbrain.com. A quick reminder that the conversation continues on Twitter at #SCIWebinar from 1 to 1:30 Eastern Time, where some of these questions that did not get answered will be, in fact, answered. So if you hang on the line and the questions that you asked that were not answered have been written down and kept on hand for answering in that mode. Again, our panelists today, Marcia Conner of Sensify, Jake Barr of Procter & Gamble, Joe Krkoska of Dow AgroSciences, and Lora Cecere, founder and CEO of Supply Chain Insights. These slides you've seen today will be available, and this webinar will be posted for viewing on demand on supplychainbrain.com. I thank everyone for attending. I thank all of our participants and all of our audience for listening. All of you guys have a great day. Thanks and bye-bye.